Buenas tardes, amigos y amigas del Proyecto Grado Cero, amigos de la UNAM y amigos de CIDE. Estamos aquí con la doctora Melissa Schwartzberg. El día de hoy vamos a hablar de la regla de supermayoría en materia electoral. La entrevista va a ser en inglés. En esta ocasión vamos a platicar con esta distinguida profesora de la Universidad de Nueva York y pues vamos a comenzar. Está con nosotros nuestra compañera Lupita y la doctora Schwartzberg. Lupita, para comenzar.
Hi, Professor. What we have to understand the majority of rules and what is the concept of that?
Of majority rule or supermajority rule, or both? Of supermajority rules. Supermajority rules, strictly speaking, are rules anywhere that require 50% plus 2 votes to 100% minus 1 vote. They lie in that range. And what I argue they do is they enable a minority to have power over a majority, defined in terms of 50% plus 1. So they shift power from a majority to a minority. This may, under certain circumstances, be beneficial, but by and large, I think of it as a violation of a certain type of equality.
Okay, Carlos.
My question is, with the supermajority rules, can we talk about equality? Can we have equality in the society making or realizing supermajority rules?
Well, it depends on how we understand equality. I think supermajority rule violates a certain type of equal weight in a vote. Now, of course, if we think that what's being protected by supermajority rules are really important constitutional provisions that give rise to the flesh of equality, then we might think that a supermajority amendment rule protecting those norms might be defensible. I accept the use of supermajority rules under those sorts of restrictive circumstances. In many cases, though, it enables a minority to have power over majority. It violates the provision of one person, one vote, and the equal weight of voting. So, yes, we can have equality of a certain form under supermajority rule, but we run the risk of introducing inequalities of other forms or protecting existing inequalities, which I think is really the major risk associated with supermajority rule.
Okay, the other question is, does the supermajority rules exclude or make an exclusion to minorities, and what is the consequences for the minority when you apply the supermajority rules?
Yes. So one reason why supermajority rules are sometimes supported is that it seems to enable a minority to veto actions that a majority would take that would be harmful to their rights or interests. And this is indeed a very important use of supermajority rules. The risk is which minority is vetoing under what circumstances. So if you have a minority that's vetoing, a powerful minority that's vetoing, for instance, redistribution, well, then there may be profound societal costs. If we are enabling a minority to veto changes to the status quo that benefit them, that we think would be beneficial to the society as a whole, then there may be profound consequences that way as well. So there are going to be benefits. It depends on what the particular domain is. The way in which the book generally argues is that there are going to be risks associated with any sort of decision, and the question is how to calibrate those risks.
Okay, in the order of these ideas, how we can do to listen and take the ideas of the minorities?
What can we do as instead of supermajority rule to enable minorities to operate? Yeah, that's a really important question. My thought is that rather than shifting power to just any minority to veto decisions by majorities, if we're really concerned about the most vulnerable minorities, the rights and interests of particularly vulnerable, perhaps ethnic minorities, we're better off ascribing things that I call targeted vetoes to these minorities, making sure that a particular minority that we have identified through a deliberative process have the power to block or to at least ask for reconsideration of policies. So that's one mechanism. The other mechanism is introducing more deliberative institutions at all different sorts of levels, opportunities for minorities to voice their concerns, to make sure that voters understand the nature of their interests, and that this is a better means of making sure that the minorities who might be otherwise subject to abuse at the hands of majorities are able to have their say.
Okay. Until you have the ideas of the minority, what is the importance of the supermajority rules? It's a kind of flexibility institutional solution, or why is your opinion about that?
Yeah. So my concern is that supermajority rule is used for all sorts of decision making, for both trivial issues all the way up to constitutional issues. It ends up being a one-size-fits-all solution to the concerns about majorities. What my suggestion is that, again, we should think about the circumstances under which we really want to protect, we want to insulate ourselves against certain predictable forms of bias, particularly grave consequences. So, for instance, perhaps in jury rules, or what, as I've suggested, for basic rights protecting equality. Those are good circumstances under which we might want to use supermajority rules. In other cases, we might be better off thinking about, for instance, these targeted vetoes or deliberative institutions or other sorts of mechanisms, sequential majorities perhaps, as solutions rather than to passionate majorities, for instance, rather than always using supermajority rules as our solution.
I have a question. Can we say that supermajority rule, or can we use the supermajority rule to legitimate the government decisions? If we have a supermajority, we can say we are legitimate to the society?
I think that's a complicated issue, and it has to do with how we track consensus in society. It might be the case that having a supermajority, that's saying that we need a particular supermajority to be able to make a decision, ensures that we have consensus support in favor of governmental action. Of course, at the same time, depending on where we set the threshold, the vote threshold, it might be that we have, let's say if we set the threshold at 75%. It might be that we have a consensus of 60 or 65 or 70%, but we just can't hit that 75% threshold, and so we have 26% saying, nope, you can't do it. And I think that the consequences of that for legitimating decision-making is likely to be very pernicious in the long run. So that's the risk of using a vote threshold as an arbiter of whether consensus has or has not been reached. Again, I think that the better way of ensuring consensus to the extent that we want that is through encouraging deliberation rather than through the manipulation of a threshold.
Well, you have said some negative things about the supermajority rule, but what are the positive ones?
Yeah. Again, I think supermajority rules might be used beneficially in circumstances in which we think that there are certain very grave and unequally distributed risks associated with change. So I think for basic rights of a constitution, we might think that the risk of change greatly outrisks greatly outweighs the risk of having them remain stagnant. It doesn't mean that they should be permanently shielded from amendment, but it does mean that we would want to make sure we very carefully considered, we have very overwhelming support for change before we do so. So that's one sort of circumstance under which they could be beneficial. Likewise, I think for juries, I think that I think unanimity has certain consequences in terms of coercion that I think we should be worried about. But I do think that a supermajority rule biasing in favor of acquittal, for instance, might be attractive. We want to bias ourselves in cases in which we think the moral and what I call the epistemic risks are unequally distributed, rather than always using it regardless of what we think the risk distribution might be.
Okay, and how can we support this idea of supermajority rule in countries that not have the idea of democracy?
If we don't have the idea of democracy, playing around with vote thresholds is the least of our problems.
Well, at last, can you tell us some ideas about the experience of the supermajority rule at the United States?
Yes. Yeah, I think by and large for Congress, the use of the filibuster has a very shameful history, beginning with civil rights legislation and continuing forward. I think fortunately, people are starting to realize that the filibuster has introduced sclerosis into the legislative process, and my hope is that in the years to come, eventually its use will dwindle.
Okay, amigos y amigas, muchas gracias por sintonizarnos. Professor, thank you very much for your aportations. We are very thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias y nos estamos sintonizando. Hasta la próxima. Estamos aquí con la doctora Melissa Schwartzberg. El día de hoy vamos a hablar de la regla supermayoría en materia electoral. La entrevista va a ser en inglés. En esta ocasión vamos a platicar con esta distinguida profesora de la Universidad de Nueva York y pues vamos a comenzar. Buenas tardes, amigos y amigas del proyecto Grado Cero, amigos de la UNAM y amigos de CGEP.